welcome back to another episode of the Catholic Buzz podcast, and happy Easter to all of you who are either watching or listening to us. My name is Father Daniele, and I'm joined during this Easter season by Josh Sullivan.
Hello.
Happy Easter.
Thank you.
And Matt Van Milligan.
Hello.
Happy Easter.
Happy Easter.
So I hope that your Easter celebrations went well, and we are now officially in what we call the Easter octave, where we celebrate Easter for 8 days. So we start, obviously, Easter Sunday. We're at the Easter Vigil, and it goes till Divine Mercy Sunday, which is this coming Sunday.
Mm-hmm. Crazy. Yeah. Lots of fun.
8 days. Remember? Do you remember we talked about the Christmas octave?
I was going to say, that's
Yeah.
what brought
Yeah.
me to, too. Yeah, there's the Christmas octave. And
we
the
celebrate
days of
Christmas for 8 days, and we celebrate Easter for 8 days. And so we celebrate each day of this week like it's Easter Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
So we can use the same readings if we want. We can celebrate so it's a really the resurrection. Yes, it's the significant event of our faith. So we celebrate it
Do we know why it's 8 days? Anybody know?
because that's the length it takes from one Sunday to the next.
See, I always just think, because we're always like in our faith, there's always 3s, there's 12s, there's 7s. Those are all holy numbers, 40 days for Lent and for everything else. But why is it the Easter octave? Is it I feel like it's some, I'm going to say almost French tradition, but it's not, it's in the church. It's something that we celebrate. Do we know?
No, I was just going to be a pain and say, because it starts with the prefix oct. It's 8 days because that's
His name. Anyways, okay, we don't have to.
Yeah.
It's something we'll look up.
Yeah.
We'll come back.
And it is the two greatest feasts of the church year, right? Christmas and Easter. So we celebrate the octave, which is to extend the great celebration, right?
I think we're Christians and Catholics specifically are always willing to extend celebrations.
Yeah, exactly. So remember when we celebrated this past weekend, when we celebrate Easter, there's lots that goes on. Last week we talked about on the podcast everything during Holy Week, from Palm Sunday throughout the week, Holy Thursday, and Good Friday. We kind of ended last week talking about Jesus. They had speared him on the side, and he died. And so just quickly to recap, they take the body down. Remember the scriptures say that Joseph of Arimathea, who was a secret disciple of Jesus because of fear, right?
Mm-hmm. He had a prominent place too, right? He was kind of rich.
Yes,
and so
because he was able to go and approach Pontius Pilate and say, "Hey, is it okay that we take the body?" Pontius Pilate gave him the permission to go and take the body down. They laid him in the tomb that had never been used before, and they covered up the tomb with a stone. And in the gospel account of Matthew, there's people like, "Hey, remember what this guy said? He said that after 3 days he would rise again. So let's make sure that we seal this tomb up as best as we can, or else they're going to come and steal his body."
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that really stood out to me this time, was that people came and said, Jesus said he was going to rise again in 3 days. Let's go put guards on this thing. Let's seal it up with a big stone. Let's make sure this doesn't happen, because, we don't want his apostles to say, "Hey, look, he rose." Yeah. They kind of did a preemptive there, like we already seen him do some pretty crazy things.
Yeah.
And we don't want this one to be one of those things.
Yeah.
So why was it so important that he rose? Why wasn't just the death enough? I mean, the death is what kind of brought it up to the he died on the cross for us, so that our sins are forgiven because of his sacrifice on the cross. Why was it important that he rose?
I would say, okay, so it is important, but it's possible to imagine that, God effecting our salvation with just the death on the cross. Yeah. But there's a significance added by the fact that he rose again, and more than that, he rose bodily. That is, that it was just kind of this ethereal spirit rising and hovering above that. That is no, he was actually resurrected. And again, not merely revived, or not merely not in the same resuscitated as like Lazarus, or like the soldier's daughter. that it's his glorified body that's resurrected. That's and the book of Hebrews does a really good job of tying this all together to say that like Christ rose bodily, like that we might rise with him. That like even when it's tied, it ties the whole kind of salvation narrative together. That at the end of all things, we rise bodily. And in the scriptural accounts from the Gospel of the Passion from Matthew, there's like the bodies of a whole bunch of saints and holy people rise or like come up out of the tombs at the death and resurrection. That like this, there's actually something significant about it's not just your sins are forgiven, but you are rising to new life. Mm-hmm. You're rising to being adopted sons and daughters of God. That like you rise with Christ, and I think that like the theological significance of the resurrection can't really be overstated.
No, and also the resurrection also puts our Christian life in perspective, mm-hmm. right? Like what Jesus had been speaking about, and our life together with God is not just for us to understand here, mm-hmm. right? But it's for all eternity. Like God who gave us life will also bring us to new life. I don't think we would have clearly understood that without the resurrection, right? Like the story would have seemed ended and pretty sad if it just ended on the cross.
Yeah.
Jesus, he died for our sins, which is fantastic. I mean, and that's not to take away from what Christ did for us. But if that was the end of our story, Christians are always like, think about the fear that Christians live in today. Okay. So, and there are parts of the world where literally people like the Christians are fearful for their lives. Maybe in our part of the world, we're fearful more about what would happen, I guess, to us when we really express our faith in Jesus, whatever it might be. But this sort of persecution of Christians is like everything ends at the cross. It's like we're made to be martyrs. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Yeah. That's what would happen without the resurrection. The resurrection shows us that after the crucifixion, after suffering, there's new life.
Yeah.
And if you ask anyone who's been through suffering, and has united that suffering to Jesus, there's new life after the suffering.
Yeah.
There's new life. And like the resurrection gives us that, like the church calls it the Paschal mystery. The church calls it like our new hope. You know what I mean? Like, it's the Paschal hope. It's what God signifies to us, that no matter what happens, he's in it with us for the long haul, and we're in it with him for the long haul.
I think back to one of the famous sayings is the only two things that are certain in life are death and taxes.
Yeah.
But that is kind of one of those, like, death has always been a certainty. We all know that one day we're going to die. But Christ rising from the dead shows us that he not only had the power that he said he had, but he wasn't only who he said he was, but by rising again from the dead, he had power even over death, even over the thing that couldn't be possible. Even death conquered Jesus, or that couldn't be said anymore. Like Jesus conquered death.
Right. Yeah. Like Jesus destroys death.
Yeah.
Right. God conquers death. And we believe, remember in the funeral rite, if you've been to a Catholic funeral, we use the words that life is changed, not ended. Right? So when Jesus died on the cross, life was changed. It wasn't ended.
Yeah.
Right? 3 days later, he rose from the dead. He rises from the dead and like Matt said, he didn't just come back to life like Lazarus. He's the resurrected Jesus now.
In a new glorified
he's
body.
Glorified. He transcends time, transcends space, like he is a new creation. He's the resurrected Jesus. That's what we're called to. We're called to rise up to new life with Jesus. Yes, at the resurrection, when Mary and Martha, the sisters of Lazarus, were like, yes, Lord, we know that he will rise with you to the resurrection of a new life, when Jesus was talking about raising Lazarus from the dead. But we're called we know that we're called to that, the resurrection after the dead. But we're called to new life here.
Now.
Like, we're called to new life here. That's what the joy of Easter brings. It's like for 40 days of Lent, we have looked inside of us. We have increased our penance. We have increased our prayer, hopefully. We've increased our fasting and almsgiving, and all to show that we are committed to rising to that new life. Like, we're supposed to look at the things in our life that we struggle with, that are preventing us from loving Jesus with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength. And then we're to overcome them together. Yeah. Right. And I think about this. Okay. I think about last week we talked a lot about the apostles. Think about the apostles when Jesus died on the cross. Okay. And they're walking with him, whatever it might be. Then he dies on the cross. Well, now all of a sudden they are sad. Mm-hmm. And they're angry. They're probably really disappointed. They're probably really confused. They're probably really embarrassed and ashamed that they spent all this time with Jesus, and now he's dead on the cross. They lock themselves in a room. They hide from the rest of the world, and there's this tension between them. It's like, Thomas, where were you? And blah, like, we were supposed to be like. There's this all, like, it seems like everything's going wrong.
Yeah.
And then when Jesus rises from the dead, they are literally brought to new life. Like they are literally made new. Mm-hmm. And their sadness turns to joy. Their anger dissipates. They break out of this place. And you know what's great about it is none of them say, I wish we can go back into hiding. Or I wish I could be sad again. Or I wish I could be angry, or whatever it is. They are literally made new. And that's what God does for each one of us. Through the resurrection, God makes us new.
I love what you said about the suffering, because that is, I mean, through the little bits of suffering that I've had in my own life, that is kind of something, but seeing other people as well. You always wonder how certain people could go through such tragedies in life and then come out on the other end with their faith and with this awesome belief, and that they have such a, like, we look up to those people, and that they have such an awesome, deep faith. One of the things you said too was that the apostles, like, that's part of it with the resurrection, right? Jesus died for our sins. Great. That's awesome. We're forgiven, bridge bonded, whatever. Like, we're back on track with God. However, one of the big problems there, where were the apostles there? And we were talking about a little bit before the podcast. The apostles are in the upper room. They're on the road to Emmaus, where they're walking there, like, I guess that was a nice 3 years. You know what I mean? And that's kind of, they were talking about how this just didn't happen the way that they expected it to happen. Yeah. The way that they thought it was going to happen. And were they telling anybody about it? Were they telling people, hey, yeah, I was there when Jesus did this? No. Because without the resurrection at this point, I'm not going to say that they're ashamed, but I think, like, they think all those feelings that you just kind of described, they're ashamed, they're questioning, they're like, what does this mean? You know what I mean? Because I'm not quite understanding it. When Jesus appears again, there's a couple of things that are kind of cool about the way he appears, because we have different accounts of how he appears. He appears first to the women in the garden. And the cool part about that is, if they wanted to, appearing to the women, if this was a lie, this was appearing to the women as credible sources at that day and age, was not the first person that they would appear to. They would appear to people of good standing, and normally men, because women didn't really have they weren't credible witnesses in court, right, at that time. And so the apostles coming forth and saying he appeared to the women first, that's not credible. That doesn't make it a credible source in a witness court. So if it's going to be a lie, let's tell the lie the right way, right? Let's do it politically, and figure out. So the fact that they're doing this, the fact that when they're coming out, they're telling people we were hiding in the upper room. Like, they're not ashamed to tell the full story and to show how weak they were, or the spot that they were in, because that's a shameful thing. If you're telling a story about something and you're lying, you're always going to come out on top, right? I mean, that's kind of the way that when we lie, we always look a little bit better than we really were. from our perspective. That's not how the apostles told the story of the resurrection. They were scum. They were the ones that ran away from Jesus at the end. They were the ones hiding in the upper room, not doing what he said. They weren't like that. That's who. And then they were off fishing on a boat by themselves, not preaching the gospel, walking away from Jerusalem. Like that's where they were before Jesus appeared to them. So that's
Yeah, I like what you said there, because that's the first. So the first massive Easter that we celebrate is at the Easter Vigil, right? So that's the first massive Easter, and that's the gospel account that we hear at that mass this year. It was from the Gospel of Matthew, because we're in the year of Matthew, and so it's like the women were there, and who are you looking for? Do not be afraid. I know you're looking for Jesus who was crucified. He's not here. He's been raised from the dead. And then that's the Easter Vigil option, which you can also read on Easter Sunday. But if you are going to read the one prescribed for Easter Sunday, it is from the Gospel of Luke. There's two options. If you have an Easter Sunday Mass in the morning, you can read the one from John, which is Mary Magdalene, Rabuni, that sort of story, Mary Magdalene, that she thinks he's the gardener. Yeah. But if you have an Easter Sunday Mass in the afternoon or later that evening, you can choose the reading from the Gospel of Luke, which is the road to Emmaus, right? Gotcha. And we're also going to hear the Gospel of the road to Emmaus on the where am I here? On the third week. So not Divine Mercy Sunday.
The week after.
The week after that will be the Gospel, the road to Emmaus. And I think the road to Emmaus gospel, because there's a lot of appearances of Jesus after the resurrection, but since you mentioned it, I want to talk about the road to Emmaus a little bit. These two disciples who were witnesses to the event, now they're experiencing some of the emotions there that we're talking about. They're walking away from the scene of the death of Jesus, because they had gotten the air taken out of their sails. These people, they had hoped in Jesus.
Yeah.
There were people who really thought that Jesus was going to save them, in the way that they thought. Of course, Jesus does save, but all of their hopes, think of someone that you really believe in and look up to, and you've given your heart to, and all these things, and the last thing you see is that person dead on a cross. This, you have no air left in your lungs. You don't even want it to do that. You fall into this depression and this hopelessness.
It talked about how far away they were too, right?
Right.
They walked. It was however many kilometers.
11 kilometers.
Okay, so they walked 11 kilometers to this place. That's almost a full day travel, right? Yeah. That's like let's say 3 hours of walking. But really, when you're talking about having to feed yourselves, or they cook a fire and everything else, that's almost a day. So you're walking a day away to kind of get there. And to be with this man who you think is going to save us. You're in that crowd, and now they're walking back. So they're walking all the way back.
The gospel says they looked sad.
Yeah.
The gospel says they looked sad because how we get that is because, Jesus by this point had already risen from the dead and appeared to them on the road. So,
so he appears with them and he starts walking, and they don't recognize who he is.
They don't recognize who he is.
And I think that's have you ever actually seen a guy, have you ever seen a guy or girl who has lost a lot of weight from the last time you saw them, and then all of a sudden you don't recognize them anymore?
Right.
Have you had that? I've had friends that have had that happen, or something has happened, and you just don't recognize them anymore. And you go, whoa, they look like a different person, a new person. The last time they would have seen Jesus would have been beaten, scourged, bloodied, barely being able to stand. He needs help carrying his cross, so they get Simon in there. That was their last image of Jesus. And not only that, but there was hours of that, right? We're talking about the whole day Friday up until 3:00. This is their last image of their Savior that they were saying. So when they see Jesus, and again, beaten, bloody, blue, so they probably swollen in eyes and places.
And these images are burned in their memory. This is a pretty traumatic event too.
And this is who they see, right?
Exactly.
And then all of a sudden, this guy appears, probably no bruises. We talk about his glorified body. So we know that he has the holes in his hands and his feet when he talks to Thomas and when he appears to his apostles. But he doesn't necessarily have them here necessarily. We don't know. It doesn't say it. But he's probably not looking beaten, bloody, ragged, swollen, beaten up to the point of death. Right? Like he's not that person anymore. He is in his glorified body,
resurrected body.
And so now he's coming and walking with them. Well, they're not thinking this is the same guy. They're thinking this is the guy that we just walked.
In as much as like if you've people who have had someone close to them pass away.
Yeah.
Like when someone passes away, like you obviously there's this sadness about them, and people like to remember someone who died in a certain way, maybe the last time they saw them, or maybe a nice memory, or when you think of that person, you remember them in a certain way, or whatever it might be. And then like when there's moments when you're in your home or out in public, and like you're just not expecting to see that person, right? Yeah. Like you're just not expecting it. So like we know when someone close to you dies, a song or something might remind you of them, but in your there's this finality in your brain or in your life that you're like, I will never see this person until the resurrection, until the new life. So again, these two on the road, after seeing the trauma that they have seen, they're not expecting Jesus. Yeah. Even if they saw this man,
they're not going to expect that. That's what it is.
It was like totally, like it was the furthest thing from their mind that this was Jesus of Nazareth, that they had seen on the cross, that he was the one that showed up on the road.
And the fact that they're heading away from Jerusalem is that they is an indication they've given up hope, or the hope of expectation of seeing that, like, because Jesus said a lot of things along the way that gave an indication of what was going to happen. But we said last week that like the disciples didn't necessarily have the roadmap. We have the benefit of hindsight. That the Son of Man will suffer many things, and they're like, okay, well, is this the end? Is this that like that? There's still something to be revealed to them. There's still a mystery that that needs to be fulfilled. Something Jesus said that that needs to come to fulfillment for them. While I'm like that for them, I think it's significant that Jesus appeared to a lot of people personally after his resurrection. It wasn't this like, it wasn't the triumphal entry. It wasn't this fanfare. It wasn't like
on a cloud. Over top of Pilate. Look at me, I'm still here.
Exactly. That it was like, it was revealing himself to the individuals who journeyed with him during his ministry.
I love this particular gospel because Cleopas. So the gospel names one of them, like one of them whose name is Cleopas. So they're walking along, and it says that they're already talking about the things that have happened, and of course they are. If a major event had happened in your life, and me and you were going for a walk, it wouldn't be 11 kilometers because I wouldn't survive, but it would be a little bit shorter. But we would be talking about that major event. We will be discussing it, right? And so Jesus comes, and I love this gospel because Jesus plays it up. Like he's risen from the dead, and he's like, what are you guys talking about?
Yeah. Not only that, I love that he walked in their stupor.
Yeah.
He walked in their stink. He walked in their mood for 11 kilometers in the wrong direction.
Right. And but let them vent.
Yeah,
and let them tell this. Like he didn't just go into like telling them about himself. He let them tell him about him. It was like, haven't you heard? Like, or have you been living under a rock? Like, do you not know the things that have happened?
And they ask him, they're like, how could you have not heard? Like, they're like, what are you talking about? Jesus says, like, how could you have not heard of the events that have just happened? Like, everyone is talking about it. This Jesus of Nazareth was killed because he said that he was God. They accused him of blasphemy. They chose to crucify him over Barabbas. Like how do you not know these events? And Jesus' reply, what things? Like, how do you not know these things? What things?
Yeah, the irony there is like, okay, if you're invested in these things as you like say everybody else is, why are you walking away from Jerusalem?
Yeah.
That it's like, on the one hand, it's like, how can you not be taking this seriously? And like, are you taking it seriously?
Before they meet the resurrected Christ. I mean, so they've met him, but before they recognize the resurrected Christ, look at the difference in the evangelization story. that they were telling, that his disciples were telling before they met the resurrected Christ to after they met the resurrected Christ, or what they realized it was the resurrected Christ, right? So before, they're venting to him about all these things that they said are going to come true, but we don't know now. Like, that's kind of their attitude. And then when they realize it, then it's a whole other story, right? Like, oh my goodness, and their faith is renewed, and they excited, they run back the other way, or the opposite way. Jesus shows us, though, one of the things that's kind of important to point out, Jesus walks with us in that walk, even though they're going the wrong way, even though they're in their stink and the mood and everything else. And he walks with them in that spot. He gets them to tell him. Have you ever had, like, sometimes if you're having a problem in your life or whatever else, as counselors and as priests listening and stuff, sometimes the best thing is just to sit there and listen. So, and to let the people work it out and talk to them. And I'm sure that psychiatrists do that too. But just is to sit there and I know that sometimes I've shared stuff with people and like to my wife or to my parents or to my, and then as I'm talking about it, I start to realize what's going on here. And then, kind of, okay, I understand now. Jesus kind of is walking with them in that point. And then if they still don't get it, then he turns on the miracle. Like he then breaks bread. So the story goes, he sits down with them.
He opens the scriptures.
But he opens the scriptures first. Like it says, beginning with Moses, he walks with them through the prophets. Like, because they had just complained, like this was the one we thought was going to save us. Right? And like all these different things. And it says, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. Right? And so like, I love it because you mentioned like an evangelization approach. Yeah. Right. So here he is. First of all, he's literally walking with the person. People
in the wrong direction.
We say we kind of say figuratively, journey with that person. Jesus is walking literally with that person away from Jerusalem. Yeah. Right. And then he listens to them. So like go out of your way. If you need to bring Jesus to someone, go out of your way, even if it's out of your comfort zone, even if it's a long walk, go, even if it's in the wrong direction and you got to come back. I mean, that was a 22-kilometer walk, I guess, anyways. So then he starts explaining from Moses, like from the beginning, all the things that the prophets were saying about himself. So he's giving them some sort of lesson here. Yeah. Maybe it was like the first RCIA course. I don't know, but here it was, right? And they're like, wow. At least they acknowledge this guy as a wise man. Yeah, because they like him.
They see the truth.
They're like, wow, this guy's really knowledgeable. And it's getting dark, and and Jesus, I like. He keeps playing with them a little bit. He's like pretends to keep going. Like the end of the walk had come, and Jesus the gospel says he pretended to sort of keep going, and they were like, where are you going? Why don't you just stay with us? So he had made an impression, at least from this, from explaining the scriptures, that they wanted him to remain. Yeah. Right. And I think in our own journey of evangelization, people, when we speak the truth to people in love, in charity, knowing that we love them because we've already walked in the wrong direction with them. We've already spent time with them
and listened to what they have to say
and listened to them. They want us to stick around. Want us to stick around.
You have a relationship with them. Forming that relationship first is key in evangelization.
Exactly.
Part of that reason is just so that you have that relationship, so that when you speak truth, they understand and they believe you, right? And so they're seeing that this guy's a wise man. He's pointed out the truth. And now, hey, why don't you stay with us for a little bit? Like, we're enjoying your company. We want this relationship to continue on. And then...
And what does he do?
I love this part. He breaks the bread.
And
then they go, whoa.
But there's two amazing things here. Well, there's more probably. But one, yes, that Jesus breaks the bread with them in their home, right? But two, that they recognize him in the breaking of the bread. Like, they recognize him.
This is my blood.
Yeah. Like exactly. He offers this Eucharistic meal and they recognize him. So they didn't recognize Jesus when he was standing in front of them. They didn't recognize Jesus when Jesus was talking about himself through the prophets, but it's in the Eucharist It's in the breaking
yeah,
of the bread that they recognize Jesus. And, ultimately, that is our goal. Like when we evangelize to people, when we walk with people, when we listen to people, when we explain Jesus to people, when all that stuff, we want to bring them to the Eucharist. And we want them to recognize in the Eucharist the same Jesus Christ who rose from the dead.
Yeah, that's awesome. I like that.
It's a beautiful, like this story is...
Jesus, again, lays it out for us, walks the walk, shows us exactly kind of how it works until that point, I love that. And in the same time, we're seeing the example of where the disciples were, these people that followed him, even closely, that they recognize him in the breaking of the bread means that they were probably present there at the Last Supper. Right, because it just talks about, when I read it over, depending on the gospel, but I think the one that we just read through Matthew, it talks about the disciples were with him, not the apostles per se, not the 12 apostles, but the disciples. So that could be any range of a number of people, but so maybe these people were here because they recognized him in the breaking of the bread.
That's right. And then Jesus vanishes from the sight.
Yeah.
Like he ran, and I like at the end of that particular gospel, the road to Emmaus, is, were not our hearts burning within us when he was speaking to us on the road? It's I truly think that, we miss sometimes the presence of Jesus in our lives. Sometimes, when people pass it off to coincidence, or they pass it off to happenstance, or whatever they call it, but we often miss, like, were not our hearts burning? Didn't we not feel the presence of the Holy Spirit? Did we not feel the presence of Jesus with us? And they were kind of like shaking their heads at each other.
Yeah. And they get it. Like they have the peace that lets them make sense of the whole thing. That it's like, and like on the one hand, this kind of mirrors most people's process of faith, or like coming to faith. That it's like that there's a certain understanding lays the groundwork for that final revelation of Christ, or like having that personal encounter with Christ. And for a lot of us, that is in the Eucharist, or that is in the, but it's also kind of a mirroring of salvation history, like the fact that he goes through the Old Testament and just like that he's revealing himself he's the Word incarnate. That it's like it's this gradual revelation of the whole picture, but gradual revelation of himself that culminates in the breaking of the bread. Like that's right. The definitive revelation of Christ is in the Word, and then but ultimately in the Eucharist itself. Yeah.
And so at the end, the gospel says that same hour, same hour, they get up and they go back to Jerusalem. Like they don't waste any time now. And this is how I picture it in my mind. On the way there, it was a very malaise walk. like a depressed walk.
It took them a full day. And they're just kind of moping and complaining and listening to this guy. And on the way back, they probably half
ran, sprinted, whatever it could be, because the gospel says they came back and told everyone that they had encountered Jesus Christ in the breaking of the bread. And again, remember what we were going back to before, we were saying, at the time of the death, when that's why the crucifixion is not the end of the story.
No, it's got to be,
because even with these two disciples, their sadness, confusion, their broken hearts were healed, and they were brought to new life. They're made new, right? Jesus makes people new, and I hope that is the experience that people have after their Lenten journey and after the celebration of Holy Week. That we're made new, that we're ready to be new beings, being made new by the Lord, and to experience here the resurrection as we wait for the resurrection to new life at the end of our time, at the end of our life. So that's all the time we have for this episode that we talk about. There's so much more that we can say about the resurrection and the Easter season, but now Lent was 40 days long. The Easter season is now 50 days long, leading to Pentecost Sunday. So let's take advantage of the grace that's going on in this Easter season. Let's take advantage of the grace of the resurrection, and let's really allow the Lord to reveal himself to us, whether it's through our prayer, whether it's through listening to what Jesus has to say, or whether it's through the breaking of the bread, the Eucharist. If anyone has any comments or things you want to share with us about the resurrection, or maybe a personal encounter you've had with Jesus, drop us a line at askus@thecatholicbuzz.com or leave a comment on our Facebook or Instagram pages. So we are wishing you all a very blessed, happy, holy Easter, and may all of us be brought to new life through Jesus Christ, who is risen from the dead. For Josh Sullivan and Matt Van Milgen, my name is Father Daniele. We'll see you next time on The Catholic Buzz.